Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday's Other Scriptures for November 17th. It is the second to last Sunday in the church year. The church calendar year is different than the outside calendar year in that the church year starts with Advent, the anticipation of not only the celebration of Christ's first coming, but also anticipation of his second coming. And at the end of the church year, which happens in November each year, we have readings that talk about the end times. And that is definitely true of our readings for this morning, the 17th. I am in a series of sermons where next week I'm going to be talking about culmination, what the end times mean for all of us. But in the readings for this Sunday, I'm going to be focusing on what do we do in the meantime. Not what do we do in the end times and what that's going to be like, but what do we do? What's our calling as we wait for Christ? So that's kind of the context. Our first reading is taken from the book of Daniel. It's the second half of Daniel is the only other example of apocalyptic literature in Scripture outside of the Revelation. And this takes place in chapter 12 of Daniel. It's towards the end that we have this reading, and it talks about at that time, which the context is really the end of the world after these major kingdoms that have been predicted have come and gone. Michael, which is the only angel in the Bible named besides Gabriel, Michael, the archangel, the great prince who protects your people, that is the people of Israel. No, we don't know exactly what that means, that archangels protect certain groups of people, but he will arise. And there'll be a time of distress, such as has not happened since the beginning of time. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found in the book. What's the book? Well, the book, which is referred to also in the Psalms and a few other places, and even more so in the New Testament, especially in Revelation, the book is the book of life, or in Revelation, the Lamb's book of life. It's the name into which all of those who are redeemed through their trust, through belonging to God, all of those people have their name in the book of life. This is different from the book of deeds, which is referred to in Revelation. The book of deeds is kind of like Santa's, list of who's naughty and who's nice, except for that everybody's naughty in the book of deeds. It's the record of all the things that we've done in our lives, and none of us measure up because all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But the book of life is the list, the book full of the names of those who trust in God, and through that trust in God and his salvation and his Messiah will be redeemed. And so in Daniel, it predicts that everyone will be raised from death. And it's the only place I think in the Old Testament that refers to both those who are raised to everlasting life and those who are raised to everlasting condemnation. So everyone will be raised. Some will be raised to eternity in heaven, and others will be eternally condemned. And then it says a great thing. It says, those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. This is part of our calling, is to lead others to righteousness. Our responsive reading for the day is Psalm 16, which calls on God to keep us safe as our refuge, part of what was promised in the previous reading, in the Old Testament reading. It says, Lord, apart from you, I have no good thing. In other words, if God's not in it, it's not truly good. And then it delights in those who are righteous. The psalm, through the psalm, we vow that we won't worship any false gods. We won't pour out libations of blood. That's when animals were slaughtered. You might know that the blood was poured into cups, and in honor of the local god, you would pour out part of that libation of blood. And the same would be done with wine. When people were eating, they would offer it to their god. We don't do that anymore, which is a good thing because it saves on a lot of floor cleaning costs. But it talks about the boundary lines falling in good places for us. The boundary lines were the edges of your field, and it really indicated your wealth. And you might know this from the settling of the West, that people tried to find the best pasture land where there were, streams flowing through it, where it wasn't too rocky and so on. So this is just an expression of the goodness of God in this life, but then it really goes on to the goodness of God beyond this life when it says, "Therefore, my heart will rejoice, and my tongue rejoice, my heart will be glad," because. And here's a critical verse that gets quoted in the New Testament: "You will not abandon me to the realms of the dead." I think the word there's probably Sheol, which means the pit. It's the place where the dead go. And you will fill me with your presence. You will not allow your Holy One to see decay. You can imagine why this got quoted, because Jesus would ask, well, who is the Holy One? Because David died and his body decayed. Well, there's only one person who was faithful, who was truly holy, and that was Jesus. And he was in the tomb for 3 days. He was truly dead, but his body didn't decay. Instead, it was raised glorious. And Christians really look at this and find a lot of encouragement because Jesus' body didn't decay. That reaffirms that God will not abandon us to death. Even though our bodies will decay, nonetheless, God will raise them from the dead just as surely as he raised Jesus from the dead. So, speaking of Jesus in our gospel reading, we have Jesus at the temple, and his disciples say, "Look, Master, look at these glorious buildings. Look at these glorious stones." It had taken King Herod the Great 46 years to refurbish the temple. Some of the stone blocks were the size of your garage. They were just massive. It was one of the great wonders of the ancient world. And yet Jesus announces that, you see these buildings, they're all going to be destroyed. In fact, he's very explicit in some of his pronouncements that within a generation, not one stone will be left on top of another. And so the disciples want to know what people generally want to know when they're anticipating the end of the world, which is, when's this going to happen? And what will be the sign of these things happening? And Jesus redirects them. He always kind of says, that's not important. What I want you to do is focus on how you should behave and keep watch all the time. It's a little bit like the kids saying, "Mom, Dad, when are you coming home? Because we were thinking of, having some friends over, and we want to know when we have to get the place cleaned up." And the reality is, maybe it's best if Mom and Dad don't tell you when they're coming home, so that you're always behaving well and the place is always in a reasonable order. What Jesus tells his followers to focus on instead is being on their guard, not being deceived, because there will be false messiahs. There are still false messiahs in the world. There are people who claim to be Jesus Christ who have millions of followers. There are people who don't explicitly claim to be Jesus Christ, but they present themselves as people's savior in our world. And what Jesus says is, there's going to be earthquakes and famines, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, and these are only the beginning of the birth pangs. What does that mean? That means a lot of people get turned away at the hospital because they're just starting to go into labor, but it's going to be hours. They're not even close to having that baby, but it's a sign that the baby's on the way. And when we have earthquakes and natural disasters, when there are wars and rumors of the world, as there constantly have been, it's always a sign that this world is eventually going to be reborn. It's eventually going to reach Judgment Day when Christ returns. We ought not to panic and get too excited about it, but we ought to be ready. We ought to be watchful. Jesus gives them some sign. The gospel first must be preached to all nations, so don't expect this to happen right away. And then he tells his disciples, when you're arrested and brought to trial, don't worry about what to say. The Spirit will give you the words. It's kind of a downer. All men will hate you because of me, but here's the good news. Whoever stands firm to the end will be saved. Very similar to the message in Daniel about there being distress, but nonetheless, that God will raise people up and they will shine. Which brings us to our reading from Hebrews, which is our epistle lesson that I'm preaching on. I'm actually preaching on the second part of it, so I haven't included the entire reading because it's part of a long argument over, and by argument I mean explanation, of Jesus replacing the high priesthood and Jesus replacing the temple sacrifices, and in fact, Jesus replacing the temple, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, I think, in the children's lesson. But it really starts with the therefore. Therefore, since this temple is going to be destroyed, since this world is going to be destroyed, what's the good news? Well, we have confidence to enter the most holy place. In the actual temple, only the high priest can enter the holy place. Only people drawn, selected by lot, maybe once in their lifetime, like Zechariah, would have the chance to enter the most holy place where God dwelled. But now all of us can enter into the presence of God through Jesus, our great high priest, and the once and for all sacrifice. So, since that's the case, we have confidence that the high priest never had to be with God. Let's draw near to him with a full assurance, a sincere heart, and a full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse them from guilt, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Now, what's that referring to? Maybe baptism, hint, hint, hint. Certainly the pure water, but even more so that having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse them. It's a continuation in the Old Testament. The temple sacrifices, the blood would be sprinkled on the people. Another reason it's good, that we don't do those things today. It would definitely change what people wore to church if they were going to be sprinkled with blood. Instead, we have communion when we participate in the body and blood of Christ through the bread and wine. We're connected to the presence of Christ and his sacrifice for us. And then it says, let us hold unswervingly to the faith that we profess, which is part of the key here that ties our readings together. And let us consider how we can spur one another up to spur one another on to good works. And let us encourage one another all the more as you see the day. Always the day means the day of judgment, or the day of Christ's return, as you see that day approaching. So the more distressed you are about the state of the world, the more you ought to focus on encouraging others and bringing others to righteousness and practicing good deeds and incarnating Christ among our families. You're spurring one another on to love and to good deeds. And this is what I'm going to be focusing on in the sermon. I hope this has given you a lot of background to discuss and consider. The Lord be with you.